Hello, everyone. I'd like today to talk about a news story that happened only recently, but be warned. It's a news story so outrageous and infuriating that, just by hearing it, you are likely to enter into a fit of possibly fatal fury and anger. During New Year's Eve celebrations in Dortmund, Germany, a 1,000-strong mob of Muslim immigrant men attacked the police and set Germany's oldest church on fire. Can you believe that? The audacity of these foreign bastards, honestly. It's always the way with these immigrant types, isn't it? Germany's kind and gracious enough to offer them a home, and the first thing they do is go about attacking the police and burning the oldest church in the country. Typical. Now, the only thing that could make this story even more insulting and outrageous is if anything that I just said were actually true. You see, the events I just mentioned didn't really take place. It was all made up almost out of thin air, but you wouldn't know that if you were reading Breitbart come on the 3rd of January because that website reported all of those events as true. So what's the actual truth here? Well, during New Year's Eve celebrations in Dortmund, a stray firework did light some scaffold netting on fire next to a church, which isn't actually even Germany's oldest church, by the way, but the netting was extinguished about 10 minutes later with no actual damage to the church. And here's some current pictures of that church taken just the other day, kindly provided by one of me subscribers in Germany. And as you can see, it's a very much still there. And here's the extent of the fire damage. Would you look at that? Now, in Germany's ongoing migrant arson epidemic, I'd say that this ranks right alongside the time that Guy burned his toast. So anyway, the abject horror of some singed scaffold netting aside, why am I talking about this story? Well, this sort of overblown, hysterical reporting of a minor incident is something that I've been noticing more and more lately. Now, maybe I just haven't been paying enough attention up till now. Or maybe folks are just being more blatant with their propaganda these days. I don't know. It's probably a bit of both, to be honest. Regardless, I'm noticing it now. And there's a pattern to this sort of thing. Firstly, some dreadful site like Breitbart or some tabloid newspaper will publish a completely morally outrageous story that is either entirely made up or exaggerated to the point of absurdity. Then the story will do the rounds on Twitter and Facebook and the likes. And of course, some of me YouTube polls will do their bit to make sure it reaches all of their subscribers. So what I want to do today is take a look at a few of these stories. We'll take a look at the initial reporting, the reactions to it on YouTube, and also, with the benefit of hindsight, we'll re-examine the stories and check for later developments and therefore see if all the fuss was justified. And the first case I want to look at concerns Thomas Salby, the balcony man. On the 22nd of July, 2016, as you might be aware, a teenager called Ali David Sumboli shot 9 people at a McDonald's in Munich, Germany. Shortly afterwards, a man called Thomas Salby shouted at and insulted Sumboli from the balcony of his apartment, and he also threw a beer bottle at him. The argument was captured on video by a neighbor, and Salby was generally celebrated for standing up to the shooter. Shortly thereafter, however, someone reported Thomas Salby to the police for insulting the shooter, using the justification that provoking someone who has a gun is probably rather stupid. And so the police opened an investigation. A very short investigation, as it turns out. You see, the prosecutors very quickly came to the conclusion that the person reporting Salby to the police had the order of events wrong. In the opinion of public prosecutor Thomas Steenkroos-Koch, whoever reported Salby must have thought that his insulting of Sumboli happened before the shootings took place and was therefore a possible trigger for them. But actually, The exchange happened after the shootings, and Samboli did to kill anyone else afterwards except himself. And happily enough for Salby, in the opinion of the Munich public prosecutor's office, the argument could have actually distracted the shooter from pursuing further targets. And as such, they announced that they were going to drop the investigation. They told this to the Munich-based newspaperettes on the 4th of August 2016. To the say this so the fan knew they do it with Lucio, of course. That's important, as it turns out. Now there's a few more dates to come, so I'm gonna mark this on a little calendar here so we can keep track of everything. So there we go. On the 4th of August 2016, the prosecutors told a local newspaper that the investigation into Thomas Salby was going to be dropped. And so that's the end of that. Right. Salby's case was investigated. He was found to have done nothing wrong. Prosecutors announced the case is being dropped. The end. You'd think. You see, the very next day, on the 5th of August, the following story appeared on breitbart.com. View on the film, the story, view, the view, balcony man who stood up to Munich shooter to face prosecution for insulting the dead. The Munich resident who hurled insults at shooter Ali David Samboli as he was carrying out an attack on a shopping mall has been accused of libel, the Munich prosecutor has announced. Now, what Breitbart don't report in this story is that that same Munich public prosecutor's office had already announced to the press that they would be dropping the investigation, because why let a little detail like that get in the way of such a great source of outraged clicks? And while you rehear, remember to visit the official Breitbart store and buy a shirt and a really stupid belt buckle. Now, on the same day as this Breitbart story, there was a very similar story on the website of the British newspaper, The Express. Brave man who stood up to Munich shooter now facing prosecution for insulting killer. And this story, like the Breitbart one, neglects to mention that the case was already being dropped. So what do we think here? Is it just a case of very lazy journalists not checking the facts on the stories they rewriting, or is it a deliberate lie by omission? Only reporting the first half of the story on purpose, because it paints a picture of an ultra-German state that will punish a patriotic man just for insulting a murderer. Who knows? And I'd just like to briefly highlight a comment on the Breitbart article by user Snortripper. Okay, this is really poor reporting by Breitbart here. I've taken a run through the German press, and what happened was someone reported Mr. Salby thinking his shouting insults at somebody had actually provoked the killings, not knowing they'd already taken place. The Munich state prosecutors dropped the case. So either a deliberate clickbait article by Bull, that's Breitbart London, to get everybody frothing, or just another drop in quality control. Now this comment was posted on August 5th. The same date the story was published, and is one of the highest rated comments on the article. So, for instance, if you were someone making a YouTube video featuring the story several weeks later, even a cursory glance at the comment section would reveal that the story is a load of rubbish. And speaking of during the mass shooting in Munich on the 22nd of July 2016 that took the lives of 9 people and wounded 36 others, Thomas Salby, a 57-year-old German man, hurled abuse at the shooter, Eli Samboli, from his balcony, while many praised Mr. Salby for standing up to the gunman who aimed shots in his direction. He was charged by the Munich prosecutor for libel for his comments. During the deadly attack, he repeatedly called the gunman a wonker and told him to fuck off. All I had was a beer bottle to throw at him, but if I had a gun I would have shot him in the head, the Munich resident said. German prosecutors are investigating Salby for potentially insulting the 18-year-old gunman who shot himself after the massacre, and he will most likely have to pay a fine. Oh, no. So that was Black Pigeon speaks there, quoting both Breitbart and the Express on the 26th of August. So Black Pigeon had a few weeks to check out his sources there, but apparently neglected to. And Black Pigeon was by no means the only YouTuber tricked by these tabloid shenanigans. So we're gonna have a significant change of pace from annoying first world woman to the Munich shooter. Specifically how a man who stood up and shouted at the guy from a balcony is now facing prosecution for insulting the killer. That's a chap called Sargon of Akkad there, sharing the Express story in his ongoing series with the self-fulfilling title, This Week in Stupid. Now, Sargon shared the story on only the 7th of August, so well done, Sargon, for being quick off the mark with that one. In fact, I'll somewhat let Sargon off the hook here. In his segment on the Express article, he is far more interested in laughing at how bad a newspaper the Express is than talking about the actual story itself. But he still shares the story, so Sargon gets an honorable mention here. And bringing up the rear, we've got an old friend of the show. A brave man who stood up to the Munich shooter now facing prosecution for insulting the killer. Because this is the world in which we live right now. Someone can be gunning people down in the street, and you're not allowed to basically look at them and say, you're being a bit of a wonker, mate. You can't do that, because then you re-insulting someone who is higher than you on the progressive stack, and therefore you are the one who is doing it wrong. Because that makes perfect fucking sense, right? He said, all I had was a beer bottle to throw at him, but if I had a gun, I would have shot him in the head. And this is the appropriate reaction to have when someone is massacring innocent people in the middle of your city. Just getting them out of the way, bringing an end to everything. That's a wonderful thing. Except for a few re-offending the religion of peace. You can't do that because that's just not fucking allowed, right? So that's Tildia there, talking about the Express story on a live stream on his channel on the 2nd of September. So almost a month late to the party there. And I feel for Tildia a little bit, to be honest. I mean, we can hardly expect him to keep pace with an intellectual powerhouse like Sargon of Akkad. Funnily enough, however, a little later in his live stream, someone in the chat points out to Tildia that he doesn't have the full story. And Tildia responds. A lot of people in the chat talking about feelings, someone's just saying, it's fucked up. Yeah, pretty much is. Someone pointing out, someone saying, seriously, you don't have the full story about it. I don't really very much care. And also, well, first of all, I don't really very much care. Streams air for entertainment, not for being entirely factual. And second of all, this is something from the very beginning of August, about a month ago. There is quite possibly information that's come out since then. Come out subsibly information. Again, don't care. Something called entertainment. Tada! Blew your fucking mind right there, didn't I? Oh yes. Yes, you did. And as a little postscript to this segment, I'd like to have a bit of a think about Tildia's comment about the religion of peace. Now that's a sarcastic jab at Islam there, and this reminded me of something in the Breitbart article near the bottom. They start talking about a Pigeon march. That's the patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the West group. Now why are Breitbart or Tildia talking about Islam? Ali David Samboli, the Munich shooter, was not a Muslim. He was also not an immigrant. He was born in Germany. He idolized Anders Breivik. He staged his shooting on the anniversary of Breivik's shooting. He was, like, super not a Muslim. And yet he automatically gets lumped in with actual Islamic terrorists. For some reason. And I wonder why that is, he said, facetiously knowing the answer. So anyway, let's move on to our next story. And this one concerns the Ussel of Bute in Scotland. So in December of 2015, 15 Syrian refugee families were relocated to the Scottish island of Bute. Bute. I think that's how you say it. And in February of 2016, something terrible happened. Police arrest man for offensive Facebook post about migrants. British police have promised not to tolerate any speech that could cause offense on social media regarding Syrian migrants after arresting a man for Facebook comments made about recent arrivals on his small Scottish island. The tiny Ussel of Bute in the Firth of Clyde, which has a total population of just 6,498 in 2011, is expected to take in around 1,000 Syrian migrants, with 12 families already arriving since December last year. Picture above. Now, I'm as excited as the next guy to be outraged about this offense to free speech, but I have to pause a moment here. Bute is going to take in 1,000 Syrian migrants. I'm very sorry to Breitbart there, but that's not true. You see, if we click their link for the source about the 1,000 Syrian migrants, we retake into an Express story from the 6th of December, which says they are among the first of about 1,000 refugees who are to be relocated around the west central area of Scotland. So 1,000 refugees are being relocated to central Scotland in general, not this one Iceland specifically. Only 15 families were relocated to Bute, so unless all of those families have an average of 60+ members each, I doubt breitbart's 1,000 figure is entirely accurate. So how many refugees in total were actually sent to Bute? More families are set to arrive on Bute over the next few weeks, which will bring the total to 28 adults and 31 children. So 59. I mean, that's okay, breitbart. You were only 941 off. Anyway, oh, sorry about that. Let's get back to the outrage, shall we? However, commenting on the comparatively huge and sudden influx of Muslim immigrants only just became a very risky business for local residents. Police have confirmed they've arrested a 41-year-old local man under the Communications Act after receiving a report of a supposedly offensive comment made on Facebook regarding the migrants. So isn't that awful? You simply comment on the migrants' arrivals completely neutrally and non-offensively, of course, and you end up arrested and thrown in jail. George Orwell's 1984 has finally come true. Raleigh, my YouTuber brothers, don't let this injustice stand. A man was arrested in Scotland over offensive social media posts directed at Syrian refugees. And now Agu got arrested for Facebook posts about Syrian refugees in Scotland, which is, at first I kind of panicked about this because we had millennial woes on, and he describes himself as a Scottish guy. I am like, Jesus Christ, let me find out it was him. A man has got arrested for Facebook posts about the Syrian refugees in Scotland, and this is something that would normally shock me. However, due to the fact that I operate this channel and every day I talk about similar news, it's now like, it was bound to happen sooner or later. Police in Scotland have said the arrest of a man responsible for a series of offensive Facebook posts about Syrian refugees should send a clear message that such social media abuse will not be tolerated. Should send a clear message that such social media abuse will not be tolerated. Should send a clear message that such a social media abuse will not be tolerated. We will not tolerate your criticism of this group. These people are beyond reproach. I consider myself kind of a free speech absolutist. I really agree with case law in the US on freedom of speech. The very, very rare exceptions to freedom of speech are basically direct threats of violence. Freedom of expression and opinion. Well, outside of the cuss, that's also a thing of the past. Post your disgruntlement of the government's policies and you will be arrested in many countries in the West. So let's see, what exactly did the person say, which US required the police to burst in because it was probably a crime being committed there. Right. Now, we don't have any specific information on what was said in the post. Wait, what? We don't know what he said. Well, okay, I mean, from how everyone is acting, I'd assume that the man had just politely disagreed with the government's immigration policies. I mean, everyone has a right to free speech, but as YouTube channel Secular Talk points out, that doesn't cover threatening people or inciting violence. I mean, this guy could have been threatening to cut the refugees' heads off for all we know. So why don't we know what he said? Well, when these YouTube videos were made, what the man said on Facebook wasn't actually publicly known, which might lead a more critical person than me to comment that they do all unnecessarily jumped the gun a little bit. So with the benefit of living in the future, let's cheat a bit and go back in time and see what the guy actually said. And this is the Scottish Daily Mail from the 26th of May, 2016, commenting on the man's, that is, Scott Clark, appearance in court. And would you believe it? A journalist actually did some journalism and went and dug up his comments, which were posted to the Facebook page of the Scottish Defence League. And let's see what he said. Islamic invasion on Butte. Refugees were in a local boozer, all pissed, I assume. They re-dirty, they re-savages. He said he'd cut their heads off. Oh, would you look at that? He did say that he'd cut the refugees' heads off. What a surprise. But I should come clean a bit here. When I earlier postulated cutting the refugees' heads off as something that Scott Clark may have said, I was cheating a bit there, but I knew. I knew what he'd said. I'd already read this news story. I script out the whole video in advance. It's a little technique learned from Bering, where what you do is you pretend to anticipate what's coming up in your own video, and it makes you seem clever, apparently. Oh well, what else did he say? There's definitely something going down on this island, and when it does these Fs, we'll see the nasty side to who have opposed their arrival from the start. Other comments were too explicit to be printed in a family newspaper, so apparently the decapitations were just a start. So what's the lesson from this story? Well, I'd say maybe wait until all the facts are in about an ongoing police investigation before you prematurely declare the death of free speech. It's not the catchiest lesson. I agree, but, let's move on. So next up, we've got two very similar stories about German tattoos and Swedish wristbands, and we'll do the Germans first, because why not? I'm not making this up. This is not satire. Here's the story in Die Welt. Do you see that young girl, probably around 12 years old? She is wearing a temporary tattoo on her shoulder that says no, and it has angel wings on it or something. And as the story explains, it's a signal to Muslim men that means no, don't rape me. And here's a local politician who is so proud of this solution. So the use She's got a poster of a baby girl, a baby for crying out loud, that says no, not with me. This is the solution to Muslim migrants sexually assaulting German girls. Have a temporary tattoo that says no, just in case the screaming girl shouting no when she's being raped isn't enough. Maybe the tattoo will be the thing that stops a rapist from raping. Look at how proud that politician was. Young girls at German swimming pools are now being given temporary tattoos with the word "no" on them in the attempt to put off rapists. The stick-on messages say no in German and English, but strangely not in Arabic, and officials hope they will lead to a fall in sexual assaults at public baths. That was YouTube channels Black Pigeon Speaks and Rebel Media. They re-talking about a hilariously ineffectual campaign to apparently stop Muslim migrants sexually harassing people in pools. And they re-quoting a male-only article which says, young girls at German swimming pools are being given temporary tattoos with the word "no" on them in an attempt to put off rapists. The stick-on messages say no in German and English, and officials hope they will lead to a fall in sexual assaults at public baths. The new move comes after increased fears of sex attacks by migrants in the country. However, authorities say the problem has long existed in Germany's pools. Now the phrase, "the new move comes after increased fears of sex attacks by migrants," is an absolutely wonderful little bit of deception there, because it leads readers to assume that the temporary tattoo initiative was a response to migrant sexual abuse in pools, when in fact it was not. Now the male-only article was published on the 23rd of August 2016 and is quoting a news story from German news website Welt. Welt. German. YouTube channel Rebel Media showed this article and completely lied about it, as it turns out in their video. You see, if we look at this article, we see the women's and family representative of the district in which the tattoos were launched, Veronika Vashagajerla, saying that the tattoo initiative has nothing at all to do with migrants or Muslims. It's completely independent, she says. Sexual harassment in swimming pools has always been the case. Rebel Media did not choose to translate this quote, strangely enough. You see, the temporary tattoos are just an awareness-raising campaign to get people talking about the issue of sexual harassment and like a way to introduce the concept to children. It's got shit all to do with migrants. In fact, that Welt, this story quotes the German Interior Ministry, saying that over the last 5 years, the number of sexual assaults in swimming pools has not significantly changed. What actually happened here is, one German district ordered an awareness-raising campaign about sexual harassment, and some news organizations knew they could get outraged clicks if they awkwardly forced the migrant issue into the story. Migrants plus sexual abuse sells papers and gets clicks. So if all you've got is a story about sexual abuse, you just jam the migrant angle in any way you can. Speaking of, let's do the Swedish wristbands. And this one is just a straight retelling of the tattoo story, truth be told. This one even has a Snopes handily enough. What's true? Police in Sweden are distributing colored bracelets as a means of engaging young people and raising awareness about unwanted sexual offenses. However, what's false? Swedish police did not create or distribute the bracelets in an attempt to dissuade refugees from raping Swedish women. It's just another awareness-raising campaign that's been co-opted and had an anti-immigrant message completely baselessly tied to it. However, Black Pigeon Speaks would have been unlikely to notice this because he already has some rather particular notions about Sweden. The signs of decline are already observable. While many countries are sliding into social decline, the canary in the coal mine is the self-described humanitarian superpower that pursues a feminist foreign policy. When looking at Sweden, it's one of the most gender-equal countries on earth. And while they become the rape capital of Europe, they reflushing their culture and country down the toilet and pressing forward in their civilizational suicide at an ever-accelerating pace. So, Sweden has the rape capital of Europe. They've let all the immigrants in, and now they're going around raping everyone. Is any of this true? Well, Sweden does have the highest amount of reported rapes in Europe. However, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Stay with me now. In fact, Sweden's high amount of reported rapes relative to the rest of Europe is in some respects a good thing. And if you're wondering how this could be, the key is in the word reported. So let's think about this a bit more. For starters, the idea that Sweden's relatively high number of reported rapes is linked to some recent migrant influx is countered by the fact that Sweden has, for a very long time, not just recently, had a relatively high number of reported rapes relative to Europe. The Wikipedia article on rape in Sweden says, in 1996, Sweden registered almost 3 times the average number of rape offenses registered in 35 European countries. So unless these recent migrants have time machines, I don't think we can say they were solely to blame for Sweden's high number of reported rapes. So if it's not down to recent migration, why is Sweden at the #1 spot? Well, for starters, Sweden has sex crime legislation that has one of the most expansive definitions of rape in the world. More things are classed as rape in Sweden, on average, than in the rest of Europe. And this brings up an interesting point. It's very difficult to compare crime rates across countries that use different definitions of the crime. For example, I'm quoting Wikipedia again here, unlike the majority of countries in Europe, crime data in Sweden are collected when the offense in question is first reported, at which point the classification may be unclear. In Sweden, once an act has been registered as rape, it retains this classification in the published crime statistics, even if later investigations indicate that no crime can be proven, or if the offense must be given an alternative judicial classification. And I'd like to ask a question here. Let's say a woman goes to the police and says her husband has raped her every night for the last month. Now, how would you record that crime? Do you record that as an instance of rape but happening repeatedly, or 30 separate rape crimes? Now, depending on how you record it in the crime statistics, that's a difference of 30 times. And of course, the Swedish police record every individual instance of rape as a separate offense. My point is that 2 countries using 2 different methods of collecting crime data could have wildly different crime statistics, even if the actual number of crimes is identical. And also, by the way, a country that actively encourages people to come forward and report rape to the police will have a higher instance of reported rapes. But that's good. That's what they want to happen. I mean, consider the alternative. In 2010, an Amnesty International report highlighted that sexual violence happens in every single country, and yet the official figures show that some countries like Hong Kong and Mongolia have 0 cases reported. And that's from ABC article about the rape statistics in Sweden. Now, I would ask anyone blaming migrants for Sweden's relatively high number of reported rapes if they think that nobody was ever raped in Hong Kong or Mongolia because, and I'm guessing here, I imagine that is probably not the case. Anyway, that article quoted just there actually offers a very good explanation of the various ways in which crime statistics can vary from country to country. As a comparison, they show that Australia and Canada have a vastly above average number of kidnappings, more than Colombia and Mexico, but this isn't because Australia, for example, actually has more kidnappings than Mexico. The disparity is explained by the different ways each country classifies and records the crime. And I quote, "So why haven't we heard any of these horror stories? Are people being grabbed off the street in Sydney and Toronto while the world turns a blind eye? No. The high numbers of kidnapping cases in these two countries are explained by the fact that parental disputes over child custody are included in the figures. If one parent takes a child for the weekend and the other parent objects and calls the police, the incident will be recorded as a kidnapping. Comparing crime rates across countries is fraught with difficulties. This is well known among criminologists and statisticians, less so among journalists and commentators. Now, this big article is included in a Sargon of Akkad video called Sweden's Rape Culture, talking about the high rate of reported rapes in Sweden, in which Sargon pretty much blames it all on the migrants. So, we know Black Pigeon speaks is, to put it frankly, a dishonest liar. He completely doesn't care whether what he's saying is true. If it supports his world view, he'll fall for any old shit. Sargon of Akkad, however, has a reputation for being a step above all that. So I thought it to be interesting to see how Sargon navigates his way through an article that actually contains a lot of counter-arguments to his. Let's take a look. Take, for example, this 2012 piece on the subject. The article begins as follows. The Julian Assange extradition case has put Sweden's relatively high incidence of rape under the spotlight, but can such statistics reliably be compared from one country to another? Which two countries are the kidnapping capitals of the world? Australia and Canada. Official figures from the UN show that there were 17 kidnaps per 100,000 people in Australia in 2010 and 12.7 in Canada. That compares with only 0.6 in Colombia and 1.1 in Mexico, which is without a doubt fascinating, but what does this have to do with Sweden's skyrocketing rape statistics? The answer is, of course, nothing. Because the author of this article is a rape apologist who feels the need to attempt to play down exactly how bad the gang rape situation in Sweden actually is by comparing it to financially motivated kidnappings. We do eventually reach the actual point of the article, though. Sweden has the highest rape rate in Europe, author Naomi Wolf said on the BBC Newsnight program recently. Is it true? Yes. Now you see Sargon cut out a few paragraphs there. Paragraphs that explain why the kidnapping example is relevant. He cut from here in the article to here. And that's a little sneaky, to be honest. He reads out the start of the kidnapping example, but gets bored and declares it irrelevant before he gets to the conclusion. And having zeroed in on the one or two sentences he actually agrees with, Sargon leaves the article and all of its explanatory context right there and never returns to it in the video. That's the Sargon of Akkad method of argument, iguis. If you just pretend to fall asleep halfway through hearing the opposing arguments, you will never be wrong. Now, to be fair to Sargon here, someone in his comments called Eric the Dread some point out all the explanations that Sargon missed. And so Sargon made a part 2 to this video where he apologizes for his mistake and then tries to explain his omission. Although, to again be fair to Sargon somewhat, even though his response is fairly selective and dishonest, he didn't have to respond to the criticism. So he gets a big gold star from me for bothering to reply. Well done, Sargon. I've gone quite easy on Sargon today, haven't I? I don't know why. I've apparently got a bit of a soft spot for the guy. Anyway, we're wandering a little bit here, so let's get back on track. So I'd like to wrap up with one more little story. Now, I just called Black Pigeon speaks a dishonest liar, who'll fall for any old shit without even doing a cursory Google search. So I just like to back that up a little with the following example from his video entitled Break Europe, Merkel and Her Migrants. What comes next? So, who is this refugee with a scar on his face? On the right side of the picture, he appears to just be a regular refugee, but on the left, he's pictured holding a rifle, the implication being he's therefore a terrorist or ISIS supporter or something. So this was a viral image from a while back. Someone posted it to Facebook with the caption, "Remember this guy posing in ISIS photos last year? Now he's a refugee. Are we suckers or what?" Well, yes, although not in the way that you meet. You see, the guy in the photographs is quite well known. He's actually a former Syrian rebel commander. He fought against ISIS, not for them, and yet here he is being misidentified as an ISIS fighter. For some reason, some inexplicable reason, he said again, facetiously. And this is really what sets Black Pigeon Speaks apart from the rest of the crowd. Most of them at least care about trying to be factual, but Black Pigeon will share any old chain email sent by our racist uncle level nonsense he can get his grubby little talons on. What this is its intellectual dishonesty. So we went through quite a few news stories there. A lot of misinterpretation, exaggeration, and lying by omission. So one might wonder, why does this happen? Well, I know why it happens on the media. They want to sell papers and get clicks, and racism sells. But what's the explanation on the consumer end? How can people who pride themselves on being rational and intelligent and impartial so easily fall for all this half-baked nonsense? I think the answer might lie in the reaction that some people give when these sorts of news stories are debunked. They get angry and upset and disappointed. But why? I mean, if I thought some terrible crime or miscarriage of justice had happened, and then someone provided me with evidence that this proved what I believed, I'd be happy, because it would have meant that a crime didn't take place. Some people, though, seem to be suffering from what I'm gonna call outrage addiction. They need to be outraged, and they react negatively when someone takes it away from them. It's anger as entertainment. And as TLDR so candidly admitted, being factually accurate isn't really necessary. And you see all flavors of this behavior, Black people in the States, immigrants and Muslims in Europe, it can be the Jews, the feminists, whoever you want to hate. It's not hard to find examples of individuals in that group doing bad things or committing crimes. But what if they don't do enough bad things or commit enough crimes to justify how outraged you want to be about them? What if there aren't enough actually real news stories to sustain your anger year-round? Well, that's where breitbart comes in. 1,000 angry Muslims burned Germany's oldest church. Did they actually do that? Well, I don't know, but it seems like something I imagine they probably do. So that's close enough for me. So that's about it for me today, folks. Should we close with a joke, though? Who wants to know something really funny? A couple of weeks before the large group of angry Muslims didn't attack the church in Dortmund, the church was actually attacked by a group of German right-wing extremists. On December 16th, a group of what the news website Dortmund 24 calls neo-Nazis occupied the church, barricaded themselves inside, hung a banner from the church that said "Stop Islamization" and "No shit," set off fireworks on the roof. When police arrived to arrest the group, they had to chainsaw through one of the doors to get them out. Now, I didn't see much reporting of this in the English-speaking press, oddly enough. I use neo-Nazis don't sell, as well as Islamic extremists or something. I mean, can you imagine if a bunch of Muslims had occupied the church? We'd never hear the fucking end of it. There's a double standard in the press. That's a bold statement there aimed at the five of you who had already noticed that. So that's kind of funny, isn't it? The same church even like 2 weeks beforehand. It's madness. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. I'd like to thank all of me supporters over on Patreon, who should be scrolling by right now, for being very kind and generous and enabling me to keep making videos. So a big heartfelt thank you to all of the names here. I love each and every one of you. And I'd like in particular to thank Runemian on Twitter again, who helped me out not only with translation work this time, but also stopped by the church in Dortmund to take a few photos for me, and also tipped me off to the earlier occupation of the church. So thank you, Runemian. You win the incredibly helpful Person of the Month award. Anyway, bye for now. So yeah, if you run out of bullets, you put a knife through somebody's side to it.